Okay, so welcome to Deep Weird Dialogues with me, Dr. Jack Hunter, where I'm talking to contributors to the book Deep Weird about their chapters and some of the ideas that are contained within them. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, who is a philosopher at the University of Exeter.
Exeter,
Yeah,
yeah. Everyone,
and
everyone gets that wrong.
yeah, where he writes and thinks about psychedelics and panpsychism. So, Peter, can you tell us a little bit about what panpsychism is?
Sure. First of all, delighted to be here, and I'm honored to be a contributor to your book. Anyway, panpsychism is well, pan means all, and psychism obviously related to the psyche, the soul, or the mind. So all is mind, very basically. It was a term coined by Patrizzi, a Renaissance philosopher. Um, But it's an old view, it's an ancient view. I mean, R.G. Collingwood said that most ancient Greek philosophers were panpsychists of one variety or another. They believed that nature was alive. And by alive, I mean, panpsychism means that every entity has a form of sentience. So not necessarily consciousness, which is a complex form of sentience, but basic feelings. Sentience comes from the word feel, so subconscious drives. A plant, for example, might appreciate the sun on its leaves and the water in its roots and so on. But panpsychism doesn't simply stop at the level of plants. It goes all the way down, really, to cells. Each cell has its own particular conatus or drive or sort of desire to maintain itself, as Spinoza says. Spinoza, another great panpsychist of sorts. And or monad, as Leibniz said, another great panpsychist. There's a good legacy of panpsychists in the Western canon of philosophers. But anyway, so even molecules have a basic form of sentience. And just as matter is more complex or more simple, so is mind. So, a human has a, relatively speaking, complex form of mind, mentality, whereas, a plant has a relatively simple one, just as its matter is relatively simple to complex animals such as us.
Very interesting. Yeah. So it's essentially the idea that mind or sentience is ubiquitous throughout matter, so throughout the universe and
Yeah.
everything.
So,
Go on.
No, sorry. So yeah, basically, and there are different varieties of panpsychism, but the sort of modern one really is from people like Galen Strawson and so on, is that our understanding of matter is incomplete. So our understanding of matter is an abstraction. That's partly thanks to Descartes and thinkers akin to him. But matter, in other words, a property of matter is mind, you could say, or matter is one way of perceiving mind. So as you say, you're right. Yeah, minds are ubiquitous within nature.
Yeah. And I know that a lot of your research focuses on psychedelics and psychedelic experiences, which are, of course, a kind of extraordinary experience, in a general category. So I was just wondering about how a panpsychist view helps us to better understand these kinds of experiences. I don't know if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways in which they touch. So, for example, there's a lot of recent research on how psychedelics induce nature connectedness, so-called. So again, it means many things, but it's a sense that nature is alive, that there's intrinsic, not just instrumental worth within nature, the natural organisms, and the empirical research shows that psychedelics seem to induce this, also related, of course, to indigenous uses of psychedelics. But there's no, metaphysical framework in which to understand those empirical findings. So panpsychism is one way in which you can sort of begin to ground that feeling or those feelings induced by psychedelics. These experiences some people have on some psychedelics of nature connectedness can be understood in this greater framework where what you're perceiving, what you're feeling is not simply a delusion. You're not sort of hallucinating that plants have some kind of inner feeling that you can somehow sympathize or empathize with, but actually they do. So it gives a kind of more anchoring of veridicality to certain psychedelic experiences.
Mm.
And that's just one example. Another example, I mean, panpsychism is interestingly related to pantheism, the notion that God is nature. Spinoza, for example, was a pantheist and a panpsychist of sorts. And there's, there's multiple reports. I mean, more common than nature connectedness, really, or maybe it's part of the same, it's on the same spectrum of connection with the outer environment, as it were. But there's many ways in which pantheism, both combined, can understand that feeling as well. Becoming, seeing that all is one, the ultimate monism that you often hear in psychedelic reports.
That's really, really interesting. So it kind of, in a way, it kind of gives like a grounding or a philosophical justification for certain kinds of experiences that might not, under the dominant, materialist view, dualism or whatever view they take, might not actually, be seen to work. So I just want to push this a little bit further, because obviously the book is deep weird, and there are certain kinds of experiences that happen in psychedelic states that are more weird than, if you can imagine such a thing, more weird than a sense of connection to nature, where you, for example, encounter, spirits of plants or of, fungi, or where you meet even stranger kinds of entities like DMT beings, machine elves maybe, or even aliens. So I wonder whether panpsychism has a place for those kinds of encounters as well.
I mean, that's an interesting question, and there's no easy answer to that. I mean, first of all, it's quite an interesting question in itself, that a lot of psychedelic experiences around the globe, not just in the Western, not just in the West, have these experiences of Lilliputians, little people, elves, fairies, whatever. It's very common. I've just read a report on these region in China where they speak about these little people induced by eating these strange mushrooms, for example. So it seems multicultural, not to mention like the Shapiri of the Yanomami tribe in the Amazonian basin and well, all over the place. Anyway, so how to explain this? I mean, first of all, it is a bit of a mystery, and there's no easy answer. With regard to panpsychism, I suppose one could make the case that when one senses, gets complex, but if one senses the intrinsic sentiences of things around one, in plants and whatever, the representation of those feelings, to which we are generally cut off in our prosaic consciousness, the empathy with those other forms of feeling might be represented in a way that is a little bit, although very strange, but yet a little bit more familiar to us, like in terms of, spatial, three-dimensional beings or four-dimensional, whatever they may be. But that's one way in which you could possibly explain them. I must say that Alfred North Whitehead, who was probably the greatest panpsychist of the 20th century, he's really known as pan-experientialist, but there's a variety thereof. He has this amazing notion of prehension. It's a type of perception where what you perceive becomes part of you. So it's a real interfusion of subject and object. And mostly we're not conscious of this. But what the mind does, he argues, is that we represent these feelings sometimes. And this could begin to explain such entities. But I mean, a lot of work has to be put on to make any sense, really.
Well,
but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you very much. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about panpsychism and how it helps us to understand extraordinary experiences, check out Peter's chapter in Deep Weird. Thank you very much.
Thank you.